Welcome, my name's Debbie Viadero and I'm an assistant managing editor here at Education Week. This is the part of the program where we recap the discussions that have been going on in our chat rooms with the reporters who moderated them. Up first is Stephen Sawchuk. He's an associate editor here, and he was moderating the discussion taking place on performance assessment, especially from an on-the-ground perspective. Stephen, you've written about Oakland and what they're up to in terms of their Capstone Diplomas. Tell us a little bit more about that first.
So we had a great discussion about the project, and it's actually an elaborate year-long assessment that has three components. They have a writing component, so they have a research paper that they have to write, and it goes through multiple drafts. And part of that is the kind of research they do. So they do, obviously some Google searching and some library research, but they also have to do an interview with somebody in their community or who is knowledgeable about the topic that they're writing about. And these topics were generally very, serious topics of interest to them. There was a kid there who had emigrated from Yemen 4 years before, and so his capstone project was, what is the effect of the civil war in Yemen on adolescents like himself, and he was going to interview his cousin who was still in the country. And then the third piece is finally a presentation at the end of the year, and so we talked a lot about that and about how you score that over the course of a year, because there's so many different moving pieces that that you don't want to just give it some letter grade and kind of let it go at that.
So how do you score the project?
Good question, Debbie. It's Oakland has three, what we would call rubrics, which is basically, it sort of looks like a big grid, and it sort of says, for writing, for example, use of grammar and mechanics might be one standard, and then another one might be organization, and another one on how you support your argument, for example. And so we had those in the booth for people to look at, and people were also sharing ideas for other rubrics that you would use for other kinds of performance tasks, because obviously if you're doing a mathematics problem, or if you're building a robot or something, then you would have a different set of performance criteria.
Mm-hmm. Your room was pretty busy. What did most people want to know about these kinds of things?
Well, I think everyone was actually really on board with the idea of, we like rubrics. We like giving descriptive information about what a kid did really well and what he or she might have done better on. But there was a challenge there, because a lot of the people in the room were saying, the problem is that then we have to somehow force this into an ABCD sort of grading system, and it is very much, I think, a square peg in a round hole kind of problem, because when you look at a final transcript, you get letter grades. You don't get these rich sort of descriptions, and so I think that's a real challenge for people. One of the people in our room actually said something really interesting, because often it's parents who are like, well, I remember getting a B or an A, and what do I do with that? And he said, well, what we did was we had the kids come up with a performance task for home, which was how to make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, and then the kids came up with a scoring rubric, right? So it's like your level of performance at this task, and then came up with the descriptors and sort of gave that to their parents so that they could sort of see, well, this is what this is. It's just sort of a different way of assessing whether you can do this thing.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought that was a neat little example.
One thing I'm wondering is how these capstone projects mesh with the standards for whatever kids are supposed to be learning in California.
In high school?
Yeah.
That's a good question. California does, like other states have, its standards for science and reading and math. And the language that actually authorizes the projects is fairly general. It sort of just says, mastery of the state-specific standards. So we didn't actually spend a lot of time talking about that. I think, though, what you would want to make sure of as you were doing this is that whatever you're trying to measure, in this case, reading, writing, and oral presentation skills, those are built on, throughout the other 4 years of high school. Because I think it's hard to assume that, right, like just you start your senior year and you start from scratch with those skills. Ideally, what you'd want to do is be working on little subcomponents the first 4 years of your ELA curriculum, for example.
How common are capstone requirements around the country?
You know, we found we did some research on this, and it turns out to be harder than you'd think to gauge, because there's something like 16 or 17 states have a policy that encourages it, but few states seem to require that you complete one of these projects. And even in the states that encourage it, you know, you have some districts that have taken it very seriously and have made this sort of like an organizing principle, if you will, for teaching and learning, and others that you know, they just kind of leave it up to, you know, to others to do. In fact, the Oakland people told me, you know, this has been on the books since 2005, and, you know, some places took it super seriously and others didn't. And it was really only in 2012 where they decided, you know, this is really a good lever for us to improve teaching and learning. And it was very bottom up. I mean, they got a few teachers on board using these grading frameworks. And then, you know, teachers liked the results, and then so they said, we want more professional development, and so the district gave them more professional development, and so now about 2/3 of senior classes are using some of these standard tools.
Okay, thanks.
So,
And if this interests you, please take a look at Stephen's story in our special report.
thanks.
Hello again. We're back, and now we have Sarah Sparks, an associate editor here at Education Week, who normally covers research. And Sarah's discussion room today was focused on group projects. How do you make group projects work? Sarah, all of us have bad memories of group projects, and in which one kid or two kids do all the work and everyone else sits back. Is there a better way?
Well, definitely educators are looking for a better way. Collaboration skills are among the most consistently sought after skills by employers, and a lot more schools are trying to find ways to develop and assess these projects. One of the things we found was people are using a lot of rubrics, using a lot of specific skills, things like how well are students organizing? Do they know what their role is? Do they know what other members of their group's roles are? And how well are they managing their time and giving feedback to each other? Those are skills they'll need later on and in class.
Do teachers have to actually teach students these skills before they undertake group projects?
Often, though. One of my guests, researcher Art Grazier, mentioned that teachers often don't. They give feedback like, oh, that was a good job, or you should talk about this more, but more substantive feedback about how they are including different members and how they're constructing their collaboration is less frequent.
And what are the skills that educators can assess students on when they undertake these projects?
Well, there's a wide array. In fact, the Program for International Student Assessment did a recent collaborative problem solving test, and it looked at a dozen different skills. But among them are things like understanding roles, understanding the organization of the discussion and the problem, understanding how to give feedback in a civil and substantive way. And that seems to be a problem that kids run into frequently.
So in your discussion room, what did people want to know about these kinds of efforts?
Well, one of the challenges that they talked about a lot was this issue of students' emotions, and particularly since middle school and high school is where schools start doing a lot more group work, students' emotions and their social dynamics really come into play. And that's often a place where educators need to step in and scaffold and teach them, I guess, a little bit of social and emotional development along with the more formal academic skills.
And what's your impression about how widely used these kinds of collaborative projects are?
Well, group projects in general are as old as schools, probably. But these really thoughtful, intricately designed projects are gaining a lot more ground, particularly as schools move to more problem-based learning.
Okay. Thank you for talking with us today. I hope you enjoyed your conversations in the chat rooms. Next up, Madeline Will is going to talk about alternatives to traditional grading systems.
Thank you, Deb.
Hello, Madeline Will has joined us. She is our writer on teacher and teaching, and thank you, Maddie, for taking time out from covering teacher strikes
Yes.
in order to join in this discussion today. Maddie's booth was focused around alternatives to traditional letter grades, the A through F system. Maddie, what did people want to know about these systems in your booth today?
So a lot of people were very curious about it. They were wondering how this works, how they can get support from their administrators, or how administrators can support their teachers, and how the results are. People are curious if students are learning as well when they don't have these letter grades attached.
I'm curious about the results too. What do teachers say about how their students do in these kinds of systems?
Yes, it's usually an adjustment period. One of my guests called it an unlearning process for students, that students are so used to kind of working to get an A or to pass the class that taking that away kind of makes them stop and think like, okay, but now we're working on learning the content and mastering it instead. So it's a bit of an adjustment, but teachers say that once their students can understand it, it works wonders. That they're saying that their students are understanding it more, are more engaged, are not asking all the time, what do I need to do to get an A? So it seems to be a big hit.
There's got to be challenges. What do they say some of those are?
So there's a lot of pushback, I think, at first from parents and maybe the other school community who might not understand exactly what they're doing. There's logistical challenges of implementing it, uncertainties about whether it goes for college and high school, and so there's a lot of unknowns. But they say that if you have the support and the buy-in from stakeholders in the community, that you can usually make it work.
I imagine parents are a tough sell sometimes.
Yeah, I think a lot of parents are a little bit confused sometimes when teachers get rid of the traditional grade book, because that's been such an entrenched part of school. But once teachers say that once you explain it, their reasoning pretty clearly to parents, that parents will tend to get on board.
Are the teachers who do these, are they kind of lone wolves, or are they working through a district-wide system where there are no grades, or a school-wide system?
I think it varies, but I've heard that it's can be more successful sometimes when it's not top down. So teachers say that when one teacher starts experimenting with grades, teachers in the building will see the results they're having and they'll be interested in trying it themselves. And you want to get that buy-in from teachers themselves instead of saying, okay, here, try this.
So what can administrators do to support teachers as they undertake these new methods?
I think it's a lot of going through the research, going through what works and what doesn't, letting them kind of trial and error, make mistakes if needed, and go through the process, and also having their back when it comes to parent questions and other stakeholders' concerns.
And I imagine teachers have to give a lot more feedback to students along the way.
Yes, it does sound like a lot of extra work.
It is extra work. I
Yeah.
wondered about that. Not so much math, but
Right.
That's great. And how widely used are these?
So standards-based grading seems to be becoming more of a trend in schools, especially in the lower grades. But when you talk about extremes like getting rid of grades altogether, is still a pretty small movement. There's about 10,000 educators in a Facebook group devoted to the movement, if that gives a sense.
Mm-hmm. So what would a typical system actually look like in practice?
So for standards-based grading, you might have teachers, instead of giving a letter grade, giving students feedback on assignments they complete, and then measuring their progress through specific course standards to see when they're achieving mastery.
Well, thank you, Maddie, for sharing your discussion with us. And next up, we have Allison Klein, who will talk to us a bit about game-based assessments. We're back, and we're here with Allison Klein, who is normally our politics and government reporter, but today she'll be talking to us about a story she did on game-based assessments, specifically formative assessments in Georgia. Allison, tell us more about what Georgia's doing in that area.
So what Georgia decided to do is there was a state law that basically said that they had to create some sort of formative assessments, which are assessments that get a sense of where students are and help teachers adjust their instruction. And so Georgia decided to try game-based assessments because that was something they heard from that was interested in from teachers. And they've created this game called Keenville, in which there are characters called Keens and peachlings. I think the peach might be a reference to the peach state of Georgia. And the games measure just different skills in math and reading on the Georgia standards, and they're for first and second graders.
How's it going?
Well, so far, the state is still sort of in the early stages of implementation. Their eventual plan is to have about 31 assessments. Right now, they only have 10 games for students to play. But the students seem really engaged by the games. The teachers really like the idea of this. The state is still working on getting out dashboards and training teachers on them and getting out other information so that it can be used a little bit more as a formative assessment. But right now, it's a really good learning enforcement tool.
So it might be possible to make testing fun.
That's the hope, right?
Yeah.
The kids definitely, I went down to Georgia and watched the tests happen in action. And the kids seem to be really into it. The game includes some kind of intrinsic rewards for them. It includes like these little beans that they can collect when they get a certain number of answers right, and they can exchange beans for all sorts of things for their character in the game called a keen. They can give the keen sunglasses or I think a cool hat if I'm remembering correctly, and they can decorate the keen's house with all sorts of things, lava lamps and guitars, and you know, first and second graders get really into that.
And students find that motivating. That's great.
They really do.
So what are the challenges in implementing something like this?
So experts that I talked about how it can be difficult to gauge the validity and reliability of tests like this. That's something that Georgia is working on. They say that it's a part of their plan.
Mm-hmm. So in your discussions today, what were the questions that people had about this? What did they want to know?
Well, a lot of folks seem to want practical advice for trying something like this in their own state. People asked for contact information for the Georgia Department of Education, so I wouldn't be surprised if the folks there got outreach from other states and districts who want to try something similar. Some other folks wanted to see Keenville in action, and Georgia said that they're working on a demonstration there.
Excellent. That sounds like fun. I'd like to see that myself.
Yeah, me too.
And how are there other states that are trying the same thing?
Not to my knowledge, and not to the knowledge of the experts that I talked to for the story. There is no other state that's trying this on the scale that Georgia is. You know, they've offered this game up to all of their districts. About half have taken them up on it so far.
Mm-hmm. And do they work closely with teachers in developing the games themselves and what they measure?
They did the games measure students' progress towards the Georgia standards. They did do outreach to teachers kind of at the beginning of the process to get a sense of what they wanted, not just from the game-based assessments, because that was they sort of decided to do game-based assessments based on that outreach, but just from this new charge to do formative assessments. And they're going to continue to do focus groups with teachers to get a sense of how this game is being used in classrooms.
And why those grades in particular?
Well, Georgia has talked about eventually expanding this to other grades, perhaps even older students who can also be motivated by game-based assessments. But the idea was that they wanted to be assessing kids and getting a sense of what they know and are able to do as early as possible. But a pen and paper test might be intimidating for kids that little. When they take these tests, the students don't even know that it's a test. They think that they're just playing a game.
It reminds me of there was a Penguins game a few years ago that was a lot like that my kids loved.
Yeah.
And what's the future in 5 years for this kind of assessment system?
So I think that it depends on who you talk to. I think that Georgia is hoping that it'll be more widespread and perhaps being used in other grades and really being used to shape and form instruction. I had an expert on, Scott Osterweil, who is a professor at MIT, and he's consulted with Georgia in creating the game. He suspects that more states and districts will try what Georgia is trying 5 years from now, although he's worried there may be some bad copycats out there. So I guess something for us at Ed Week to be following in the next 5 years.
Yeah, and we'll keep you updated. Thank you for joining us today, and thank you, Allison, for sitting in. If you are interested in reading more about these discussions, please take a look at our special report, Performance Assessments, Portfolios, and Projects, and I may have gotten that in the wrong order. But I think you'll see on the screen a URL where you can go and find the report. Thanks very much.